Bud Elliott's blue chip ratio is a simple college football rule that has been proven true time and time again since its inception in 2013. Like Doctor Strange puts in Avengers Infinity War, it's a simple spell, but quite unbreakable. The blue chip ratio's sole claim, and again, a claim that has been proven true year over year over year, is that in order to win the national championship, a select college football team must have half or more of their roster composed of players who out of high school were 4 and or 5-star players, also known as blue chip players, as they are called in some circles. There are only a select few teams that fulfill this requirement year over year, and this year these teams are as follows: Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Oregon, Texas, Clemson, LSU, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, Florida, Penn State, Miami, USC, Michigan, and if you factor in incoming and outgoing transfers, Florida State. If you don't, it's Auburn who occupies what would be Florida State's place. Ole Miss is one of the teams that Bud Elliott lists as a team that could potentially bust the blue chip ratio's undefeated record, meaning that Ole Miss doesn't have a roster that is half or more made up of blue chip players, but they have great quarterback play, great roster depth, and enough talent and seniority at different positions to where they're one of those Darkhorse teams that could win the whole thing, despite not fulfilling this simple but stout rule. Today on College Football with Sam, I'm going to be talking about these 18 teams. Some teams that could break through and defy the blue chip ratio, other teams that fulfill the blue chip ratio, but obviously your Floridas of the world are not on the same par as your Ohio States of the world. So I'm going to be separating these teams into different tiers and talking about them and their chances, in my opinion, of winning it all. And if they can't, I'll talk about what I think their season is going to look like. I just think this is going to be a fun exercise as it relates to what is a simple rule, but a rule that I've been paying attention to for the previous few seasons. And I do find it interesting which teams are at the top and how some of the teams at the top are quite far ahead of the other programs below them in regards to recruiting blue chip talent. But let's kick it off and talk about the first tier, which I list as tier 5. Can they defy the odds? These are teams that, if you factor in incoming or outgoing transfers, or you don't, in one of those lists, if you overlap those lists, these teams either miss one of those or they miss both. Ole Miss misses both. Auburn is only in the blue chip ratio's 50% threshold if you don't factor in transfers. If you do factor in transfers, Florida State is in, but they're out if you only factor in high school enrollees and then pretend as if they haven't transferred in or out. I think the transfer list, or the list that factors in transfers rather, is more interesting and more accurate, but Bud Elliott put up both lists just to show, in a sense, which programs are recruiting the best talent and also which programs hypothetically are benefiting most from the portal when it comes to blue chip talent acquisition. These teams lack a lot of 4 and 5-star talent compared to your Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgias of the world, the teams that have been recruiting at the top of the college football world for really the past decade, at least the past half decade. Ole Miss, despite not fulfilling this rule, is sixth in odds to win the national championship. They bring back Jackson Dart. They bring back much of their offensive line and added 2 offensive guards from the Joe Moore Award-winning Washington O-line of last year. They bring in Walter Nolan, 5-star out of high school, star defensive tackle from formerly Texas A&M. They bring in Trey Amos, who was great at Alabama last year. They return Trey Harris at wide receiver. They return Caden Priestcorn at tight end. And Ulysses Bentley V is a older player with a lot of experience who is waiting to have a potentially breakout, game-breaking, season-breaking season behind an offensive line that should be the strongest under Lane Kiffin. And I've already mentioned it before, but you cannot forget Jackson Dart, who's going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the country this year. Can they defy the odds? I don't exactly know, but they do have a schedule that is favorable. Lane Kiffin, I think last year had one of his best years of his coaching career. And with how much he returns and how many experienced, high-ceiling players he's brought in using the transfer portal, there's a chance. And I think Ole Miss is content with at least having that chance, getting to host Georgia, having a workable schedule, and a team that, with the upgrades on defense that they've made and the electric, high-octane offense that they can have, that they likely will have in most of the games they play, they can absolutely make a run in the college football playoff. I don't know about winning it all, but we'll have to see. That's why we're asking this question, if they can defy the odds. Ole Miss is one of those few teams that doesn't fulfill the blue chip ratio that I think at least has a sliver of a chance to win it all. Auburn, just to put it simply, I don't even think they can reach the college football playoff. Maybe they can, but if they can, that's their ceiling. The Tigers use the transfer portal well. They return Jarquez Hunter. They return Peyton Thorne. Cam Coleman is expected to have a breakout season at wide receiver as a true freshman. And they upgraded their staff, and I think their defense should be better than it was last year. And Hugh Freeze has a habit of playing up to his competition. So they have a chance against Georgia and Alabama this year like they did last year. But there's still a lot of rebuilding to do. And in order to reach the playoff and win it, you have to take care of business against the small and medium-sized teams along with the big teams. Yeah, thanks New Mexico State for winning in Jordan-Hare. And Florida State, finally, I actually think they have the best chance out of these three schools to win it all. That's definitely a bold opinion, but they return a lot on their offensive line. DJ Uiagalelei, if in the correct system, I think can at least be a good game manager, and maybe more than that. I think this year is going to be a down year at the top in regards to college football, and they return Fentrell Cypress. They return DJ Lundy. They have a great staff. They return Kyle Morlock at tight end, and they have an underrated receiver core. They've recruited well and developed well at the position, and like Ole Miss and Auburn, they've used the transfer portal well. So I think Florida State and Ole Miss can defy the blue chip ratio. Florida State would only be defying it in the traditional sense, because if you factor in transfers, they have broken that 50% threshold, which is great news if you're a Seminole fan. For Ole Miss, they'd absolutely be wrecking this rule, because I think there's still a few great, not just good, but a few great recruiting classes away from approaching that 50% threshold. For Auburn, it's going to take another year, if not another 2 years, before I think they can even contend to win the national championship given their roster situation. At Tier 4, there's not as much to talk about here, solely because, unlike the previous tier, where I think Florida State and Ole Miss can win it all, the blue chip ratio would just say probably not. 99.9% of the time they won't. The blue chip ratio here would say that these teams probably have a greater chance just solely based off of their talent alone. But I'm naming this tier, despite the fact that they're technically ahead of Tier 5, not even close. They're ranked higher on the blue chip ratio tier, but I don't think any of these teams can win the national championship. Florida, they're in a position of despair. Billy Napier's coaching for his job this season, and they have one of the toughest schedules in the country, and even though they return Graham Mertz and an offense that had some bright moments, and they bring in DJ Lagway, they lost Ricky Pearsall, their best receiver, and their defense was awful. It sucked last year. I don't think these teams have a shot, in particular Florida. Oklahoma and Miami, if they play their cards right, if certain things go right on their roster, can reach the college football playoff, perhaps even win a college football playoff game. However, I don't necessarily trust Brent Venables or especially Mario Cristobal to game manage, to game plan, and to scheme well enough to win a national championship in what would only be their third year. Only their third year with programs that when they took them over were gutted one way or another. Oklahoma by the transfer portal, and Miami by decades of mismanagement. Florida at best is going to go bowling, and I'll say it again, even with Jackson Arnold at quarterback, even if he plays to his ceiling. Same with Cam Ward at Miami. It's the same thing with Oklahoma and what should be a very talented defense this year, an offensive line that's being built mainly through the portal. And for Miami, even bringing in Damian Martinez and Sam Brown at receiver and having an offense and defense with plenty of talent, bringing in Simeon Barrow from Michigan State, game management, and not exactly being where they want to be as programs yet is definitely going to hold these teams back, in my opinion. Now, finally, we have dark horses. And I say finally in the sense that after this tier, like tier 2 and tier 1, I think have legitimately good chances of winning it all this season. Tier 3, they have a chance. They have a better chance than tier 4. They have a better chance than tier 5. But that's not saying much. For these programs, I think that if everything goes right on one side of the ball, maybe both, they can win a national title. But that's asking a lot. I mean, for everything, and I'm talking about everything, to go right on one side of the ball in order to win it all is a lot to ask, because rarely everything goes right. Look at Georgia in 2021. Their defense was one of the best in the nation, one of the best of the 21st century, at least by talent. Not everything went right, though. They gave up a 40-burger to an Alabama offense led by eventual Heisman winner Bryce Young and great wide receiver Jamison Williams, but outside of that, an offense that had a bad offensive line, and outside of those two players, didn't have a lot of star talent on it. They just didn't. And yet they gave up long touchdowns, sustained drives. And if some other things in the college football world that year went differently, Georgia could have been out of the playoff, as great as they were. All it takes is one game for your national title chances to go from X% to 0. This is not like the NBA playoffs, where you get a few games and whoever has the better overall record in the series moves on. You get one game. That's why TCU beating Michigan was legitimate, and even if people say it's a fluke or maybe Michigan wins 7, 8, 9 times out of 10, that 1, 2, or 3 times out of 10 is the result that occurred. And that's the fair result, and therefore TCU moved on instead of Michigan to compete with Georgia. So that means these teams either have to have an elite offense or an elite defense, or one of the best offenses or one of the best defenses in the country, to compensate for the other side of the ball that is lacking in some way. For starters, all of these teams, except for Notre Dame, have questions on at least one or maybe both lines of scrimmage. I know that Notre Dame loses a lot on their offensive line, but Joe Rudolph is a legendary offensive line coach. His time at Wisconsin speaks to that. His time at Notre Dame this past season or two, I forget how long he's been there, speaks to that. And Notre Dame has recruited well enough at that position, and they have a good enough strength and conditioning program. To those things, combined with a great offensive line coach, are reasons for me to believe that Notre Dame will simply reload at that position for the most part, despite losing Joe Alt and other talented players. I follow a similar logic for Michigan, for example, and for Georgia as well, and other programs who, when you have great strength and conditioning, and when you have a good position coach and you recruit well, that's the ultimate combination. LSU, I'd say, theoretically has that on the defensive line, with Bo Davis potentially being the best defensive line coach in the country, and LSU's recruited at a high level, and I think Brian Kelly is a great head coach who knows how to condition players for the NFL and being some of the best in college football. He knows how to develop. But because of all they lost, losing Mason Smith and losing Mekhi Wingo, we'll have to see how that goes on the defensive line and whether Bo Davis and the LSU program can quickly build that defensive line and really defense, bringing that defense from a disastrous unit last year to maybe an elite unit this year to alleviate some of the pressure on an offense that loses a lot. We'll see what can happen on that side of the ball. It's similar with USC. The offense loses Caleb Williams. The defense has to step up if USC wants to compete for anything that matters. For Texas A&M, they have questions everywhere, but they also have so much talent. If you don't factor in the transfer portal, almost 3/4 of their signed and enrolled recruits from the past 4 cycles are blue chip players. You factor in transfers, and they're still high up on the list, with 63% of their roster, almost 2/3 of their roster currently is made up of blue chip players. And they have Mike Elko, they have Colin Klein, and they've made great staff hires. And Mike Elko, from his time at Notre Dame, his time at A&M, and his time at Duke, I think has proven himself to be a great schemer and a great developer. And then you have Dabo Swinney, who's recruited well, not used the transfer portal, but still recruited well of a high school. Garrett Riley is in his second year with the program, and they hired Matt Luke to be their offensive line coach. He previously worked at Georgia, at Ole Miss, has a very good track record there. And with the defense losing a lot, they still have some star players, so they should be good there. If Clemson's offense can take a big step forward, returning Klubnik, returning Maffa, bringing Stool, other players, they bring in Bryant Westco, a true freshman who could start at wide receiver, that would be huge for Clemson. In this group of teams, I think that Notre Dame has the best odds to win it all. Not odds as in actual Vegas odds, but who I would give the best chance. Notre Dame at 1, LSU at 2, A&M at 3, Clemson at 4, and USC back at 5. Before we resume this video, I want to give a shout out to my Patreon channel. If you want to go the extra mile, like these guys are, pictured on your screen, you can sign up on my Patreon page via the link in the description or down below in a reply to the pinned comment. Your support is always appreciated. It is never expected, though. Rather, what I want to see, most importantly, is you hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, and clicking the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content. I also want to see your comments down in the comment section below, telling me what you liked about the video, what you didn't like, and your thoughts on the blue chip ratio and who can win the national championship this year. As an All-American or Heisman member, you do get access to occasional bonus content. As a Heisman member, after 6 months, you get free signed College Football with Sam merchandise of your choosing delivered to you. And speaking of my merchandise store, you can visit it via the link in the description or again down below in the pinned comment. It's right beside that Patreon page link, and I highly encourage you to check out my merchandise store so that you can represent the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, and we're trying to become the best college football channel on YouTube. So the more subscribers we get, we're doing a giveaway at 20,000 subscribers, and just the more support we get, that equals better content, more content. You get the picture. So just do us a favor, check out those two things, and at least investigate. Again, no pressure. Your support on this channel simply by watching this video is always appreciated. I do not expect you to join my Patreon or to check out my merchandise store and buy from there. That's entitlement. That is, let me think what coach I can use. That's like Larry Coker Miami stuff. I'm not interested in sacrificing winning for losing because of entitlement. Now we're on to Tier 2. Tier 2, I name high octane. And the reasoning for that is, by definition, high octane means high power. Or implied as like high potential. Like can be explosive, can be dangerous. Not necessarily is going to be those things unless you do something with it. The potential of these three teams here in Michigan, Penn State, and Texas is limitless. Now, Michigan loses a ton. They only return 40% of their production. Texas and Penn State do return a lot more, but they have not had the same track record of winning over the past 4 recruiting cycles, aka over the past 3 football seasons. In that time frame, Texas and Penn State have finished outside of the top 25 once, though in 2021, they've improved every year in power rankings since that season. In terms of actual record, Texas has gotten better every year. Penn State had its best year over the past 3 seasons in 22, going 11-2. They went 10-3 last year. To quickly circle back to Texas, they made the playoff last year, went 12-2, and returned much of what was a very good team. Michigan went 12-2, 13-1, and 15-0, winning the national championship over the past 3 seasons. But they lose a lot more. And to their credit, Penn State and Texas have a higher blue chip ratio. They have out-recruited Michigan over the previous 3 seasons. Even when you factor in transfers, Michigan only has 54% of their roster made up of 4- and 5-star players. For Penn State, it's 57%. And for Texas, it's 70%. You may question why I put Texas in the same category as Michigan and Penn State, or maybe you're high on Penn State along with being high on Texas. Almost everyone's high on Texas, and you question why I have Michigan here. Well, for Michigan, over the past 3 seasons, they've had the best program, and Michigan returns star talent on defense. Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle, Will Johnson at corner. On offense, Colston Loveland at tight end and Donovan Edwards at running back. And on the offensive line, it's much like my opinion with Notre Dame, or Georgia, or Oregon, or Miami, or other schools who are awesome at their respective positions, like Georgia, anywhere on defense, Iowa, anywhere on defense. They may not totally reload. In fact, they'll likely take a step back because of all they lost, but it's not going to be it's not going to be as many steps back as you probably think. And a great offensive line, along with an elite running back, or a running back who at least can be elite, capable tight end room, a quarterback who has a high ceiling, combined with a defense that is touted by almost everyone as being a top 5 unit automatically this year. If a lot, unlike the past tier 3, not everything has to fall into place for these teams to win it all. If just the majority of question marks fall into their place, like for Michigan, let's say quarterback play is just average, but the O-line totally reloads, the wide receivers are better than expected, and the defense is again the number 1 defense in the country, they can win it all even though quarterback play is not elite. For Texas, they reload on the defensive line, their linebacker core is good, the offense is the most explosive in the country. Even if they have a secondary that's still questionable, every other unit on the field is so good such that against every team in the country, or at least all but maybe 1, 2, or 3 teams in the country, a Texas will be unstoppable. And for Penn State, if the secondary reloads, especially at corner, if the defense is yet again elite like last year, the offensive line reloads, Drew Aller is great, but the receivers are very questionable, and maybe Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen for the 2nd year in a row don't play to their ceiling. Well, because of the defense, because of Aller's improved play, the tight end room, and the fact that the offensive line is really what makes the ground game and also makes the entire offense to a certain degree, well, as long as James Franklin lets Andy Kotelnicki do what he wants to do on offense, which is a big question, but let's say he does, then Penn State can contend for a national championship, and their ceiling, in my opinion, isn't that low. It's in fact very high. The ceilings of these teams are limitless, but what separates them from Tier 1 is their floors could be low. They could have some rather low floors. I could see Texas, Michigan, and Penn State all going 10-2, 9-3 this year, and depending on how the rest of the world looks, they could miss the college football playoff entirely with those records. And finally, at Tier 1, we have the favorites. These 4 teams from the Big Ten and SEC exclusively, which was the same with Tier 2, but you get the point. These are the 2 best conferences in the country. They are the obvious favorites to win it all. Ohio State and Alabama in particular, over 80%, every 4 out of 5 players on their roster were either 4 or 5 stars out of high school. That's insane. That's crazy. These rosters are talented, and Ohio State's is the most talented per the blue chip ratio in the country, with 86% of their roster being made up of blue chip players. I know that Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel made comments about how this team is the most talented Ohio State team they've ever seen, and how I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it at all, in fact. But as of this year, and by simple recruiting rankings, assuming that all players have equal value, which is a faulty assumption, but in regards to depth and roster talent, it can be somewhat useful. They have the most talented roster in college football this year. So I understand in part this belief that Ohio State needs to win it all this year, or this is something I actually agree with. They at least need to win the Big Ten, beat Michigan, and make a college football playoff run of some type for the season to not be a total failure. I think national title or bust, especially when you're Ohio State, Georgia, or Alabama, and you have a talented roster year in, year out, you can win it all any year. I don't think the national title or bust description even applies to those teams. You should just win a national title guaranteed. Not every so often, but you should be in the running every year, and in some of those years, you win it, because winning a national championship is that hard. For a team that's on an extreme drought, or for a team like Michigan, who doesn't necessarily have that same type of talent, I think the natty or bust label may in fact be appropriate. Georgia and Oregon have more than 7/10 of their roster made up of blue chip players. Georgia, I think, has the best coach in all of college football in Kirby Smart. I think that Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Day are top 4 head coaches right now in college football. And I think Dan Lanning, if he isn't already, will soon be a top 10 head coach in college football. So these 4 teams are not just the favorites by a simple system that is only meant to calculate the potential to win it all. They're not meant to calculate odds because, for example, Florida has a more talented roster than Penn State and Michigan, and everyone, including those who are not high on Penn State and Michigan, would tell you that Michigan and Penn State have a greater capability of winning it all than Florida. Oregon, Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia are in the top 4 of the blue chip ratio. I think those are the teams that have the best odds. Those are the top 4 teams, in my opinion, who have the best chance of winning it all. And power rankings would somewhat agree with me on that. They'd often have Texas in this mix. I don't, because I think Texas has too many questions on defense, and I question Sarkisian's game management to a certain degree, and even Quinn Ewers. But these 4 teams are in a tier of their own, in my opinion. They are the favorites for a variety of reasons. They have the potential to not just be elite on one side of the ball, but both. Ohio State had a generational defense last year, allowed just barely over 11 points per game, was rated by Bill Connolly's SP Plus as being one of the best defenses of this century. Georgia has produced 21 and 22 defenses that were littered with NFL talent and that were in about the same tier as Ohio State's was last year. In fact, some could say that Georgia's defense in 21, despite having an uglier performance, in the end was the better defense than 23 Ohio State. Oregon returns a ton on defense, and last year they were top 10 in scoring defense. They had an easy schedule, but they have the talent to break through, and that would be huge for Tosh Lupoy as defensive coordinator. And for Alabama, they've had the talent year over year over year to produce an elite defense. They haven't under Pete Golding, and Kevin Steele, I think, was a placeholder in a certain sense. But Kane Womack comes in, Colin Hitchler does as well. We'll see how they do on the defensive side of the ball. And offensively, Ohio State under Ryan Day is always talented there. Georgia, they bring back Carson Beck, and their O-line is going to be loaded. Oregon also has a loaded offensive line. They return Dylan Gabriel, Tez Johnson. They bring in Evan Stewart. And Alabama, they have Jalen Milroe, who may have one of the highest ceilings, if not the highest ceiling of any quarterback in the country, and he's being coached by Kalen DeBoer. And if Kalen DeBoer turns Jalen Milroe into an elite quarterback, you might as well crown Kalen DeBoer as the new quarterback guru, taking that over potentially from Lincoln Riley, depending on how he does this year, maybe over Ryan Day, because I think at one point, with CJ Stroud in particular, Ryan Day did look like the same QB guru, if not potentially a better one, than Lincoln Riley, given at the same time Lincoln Riley had Spencer Rattler in his possession. But these teams are clearly in a tier of their own, in my opinion. If you disagree, comment down below why, and I'll try and reply with some deeper analysis for these teams. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks especially to Crash2488 and Braska Rascal for sponsoring this video and channel as a Heisman member. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor Little OH, and Ismar for sponsoring this video and channel as All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video and channel as all conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.